In this video, I'll go over the evidence for evolution we discussed in class. Keep in mind that the evidence that we go through all helps us see that organisms have changed over time. Okay, so one of the first pieces of evidence known as homologous structures comes from when we compare the anatomy of organisms to each other. And what we infer is that parts that different organisms have, they actually came from a common ancestor. The most famous typical example of this is if you look at the limbs of the forearms of a human, a cat, a whale, and a bat. If you look at the internal bone structure, although these limbs play very important different functions in the survival of these organisms, inside you see a similar bone pattern but just changed by size. So here we have the humerus, let me mark them, just different size in each of those. In the front part of the arm here, there's always two bones, the radius and the ulna. You find that in all organisms. And then you have the little wrist bones, which go across, and you have the phalanges, which are the finger bones. So since these organisms all have this similar bone pattern in there, it's an easy explanation that they must all be related to related by some ancestor in the past that had these front limbs with that bone structure, and they've just changed over time. So those are examples of homologous structures. Those organisms have those bones in their limbs today because they got them from ancestors they share in the past. You can make an endless list of homologous structures. For example, your fingernails and the claws of a lion are homologous because that's a claw, because you probably got that from an organism that had claws in the past. All mammals have fur that they inherited from their common ancestor that had fur. Your eyes, your ears, pretty much every part on an organism you can deem as homologous to another organism, and is evidence that things haven't always been the same, that organisms have changed over time. The second major line of evidence for evolution is what they call vestigial structures, and those are parts organisms have today, but they don't have a function. They no longer work, so over time they've changed, and because they weren't being used, they weren't needed, they've lost their function. So examples of these include your wisdom teeth. Many people have the wisdom teeth growing in, and our mouths are so short because our faces are a little bit flatter than they were in the past, and the wisdom teeth have no place, so they're still there trying to grow in, but most people have to get these pulled because as our faces have gotten flatter, there isn't room for them anymore. Some people are actually even born with less than 4 or totally missing wisdom teeth. So they're considered vestigial because in the past they probably had a purpose. They were another set of molars when our jaw was a little bit more protruded. But today, since we're a little bit flatter, the wisdom teeth don't have a function. A second example is tailbones in humans. We all know we have tailbones and that some people can fall and break those tailbones, and they're actually very painful. But we have these bones in our bodies, but we don't have a tail. So what's going on with that? Well, it makes no sense unless you imagine that we have ancestors that we're related to that had some kind of a tail, and this little tailbone thing that we have now is a remnant, a leftover piece that shows change over time, a vestigial structure. Another one on the list that I wrote down is goosebumps. People, when they're cold or scared, they get goosebumps, and goosebumps are actually caused by a little muscle that causes the lifting of the hair on the skin and making a little bump right there. And it's supposed to do two things for mammals. With mammals that are covered with fur, when they lift up the hair and it's cold, that helps trap heat in, so it's better insulation. Also, mammals with fur, when they lift up their hair, when they're scared, when they're being aggressive, it makes them look larger than they are. Since humans don't have really fur today, we still have this muscle trying to do that work, but the effect is really a vestigial behavior, and that if you're trying to puff up, if you're in fear, you don't have any fur to puff up anymore. Another one I had on here but I didn't list is in some species of whales they have the remnants, vestigial structures of hind leg bones that don't even stick out of their body. The pelvis and the femur are there, but they don't have hind legs. The question of, well, what are these there? How did they get there? They only make sense if you appreciate, well, they come from 4-legged ancestors, and they've lost those over time as they've adapted to living in the water. Moving on, Another area of evidence for evolution is DNA and protein similarities. When you compare the DNA and or protein sequences between two different species, you find a lot of similarity, which suggests that they're related to each other through evolution. Some examples, if you compare pretty much any human to any other human, you find that there's about 99.9% exactly the same DNA sequence in their DNA. Humans to chimps, anywhere from 95 to 98% exactly the same. Human to cat is about 90% the same information on how to run it, and I'm talking about DNA specifically here. Human to fruit fly, my little genetics study guy from the research day, is about 60% the same. So you can say, well, that's just interesting that organisms that look more alike have more DNA sequences in common, or you can use it as evidence that organisms have changed over time and they have these sequences in common because they are related to each other. The next piece of evidence is called pseudo genes, which is also in the DNA realm of evidence. A pseudo gene is a gene that an organism has that's broken and no longer functions. And so in our DNA, there's literally thousands of non-working genes that scientists have identified that have been mutated as we learned how that works. And when the gene gets mutated and breaks, if it doesn't kill the organism, it ends up just staying there, and it's evidence that things have changed. I think one of the best examples of a pseudo gene is the one that's used to make vitamin C. Most people know that we have to eat vitamin C in order to survive. But and if we don't eat it, we die because we can't make it on our own. Most organisms do actually make vitamin C on their own because they have the gene that actually makes the enzyme that makes the vitamin C. Well, they looked in us and a few other of the apes. We have the gene too, but it's just been mutated in the past at some point. I can't spell mutated all the time. M-U-T-A-T-E-D. Mutated in the past at some point and no longer works. But it's still in our DNA, so it suggests that the DNA has changed. Again, another piece of evidence for evolution. There's many more examples of pseudogenes, but most people don't know those genes and what they do. And then finally, the other, of course, area that people learn about from when they're really young, evidence for evolution, is all the fossils. We have literally hundreds of thousands of fossils of organisms that don't live here on the planet anymore, which suggests things have changed. And we also have fossilized series showing how organisms have changed over time. So there's some great transitional fossils that show how legs moved from four-legged land animals to water creatures, how birds evolved from dinosaurs, human evolves from ape-related ancestors, and how horses evolved from a small little mammal to the modern-day horses there are today. So if you take all this evidence together, and the topic of have organisms changed, well, they help us scientists figure out and support the theory of evolution that things don't stay the same, that things have changed over time.